Proverbs chapter 12. Whoever loves instruction loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid. I like the New King James Version. Whoever loves instruction loves knowledge. You know what's really interesting about this chapter? It seems I've noticed more in this chapter than any other chapter that it's kind of stating these really obvious isms in this chapter that you might acknowledge that with me as we move on. But he who loves instruction loves knowledge. He who loves instruction loves knowledge. What is that saying? Well, it's stating something that's actually kind of obvious, but it's actually kind of potent when you consider it, and it actually has a lot of relevance to our generation. Whoever loves instruction loves knowledge. I would imagine there are a lot of people in your generation in particular, and nowadays, who would say they love knowledge. You know, a bunch of people apparently want to go to college for free and are really interested in going to college, and there's sort of a love of knowledge in our generation, and particularly it's probably exacerbated by the internet. You know, the fact that you guys, I mean, it's kind of dumbfounding to me to think back to, you know, the days when I was your age. When I was your age, the internet was still like basically barely working. Now, it had been in existence for at least a decade, but it wasn't as widely spread. It wasn't as widespread. There wasn't a widespread usage like there is today. This proliferation of knowledge, and what I'm getting at is this proliferation of easily accessible knowledge, because that's really what this verse is getting at. It's the idea of gaining knowledge without instruction, because this here is saying he who loves instruction loves knowledge. And there are people in our generation, this day and age, that are really on this like I love knowledge bandwagon, but they don't actually love instruction. They don't actually love taking the time and putting in the effort to go through the instruction to gain the knowledge. And I am actually going somewhere with this, because I think this is a pertinent point for us. Because there are a lot of what I would call fast food philosophers. Everybody's a fast food philosopher, actually, in this day and age. People who, you know, it's tricky even teaching a Bible study, in the sense that, you know, I can be teaching a Bible study and you can literally, in the middle of my Bible study, whip your phone out and Google something I said to see if I actually, you know, have my source right. You know, and things like that. That can be intimidating, actually, in this day and age. The idea of knowledge being easily accessible without instruction. There's something to this. There is something really to this. I believe, and I could be wrong on this, you can Google it later. I believe it was Martin Luther King Jr., but that said this quote. It's a very famous quote. It's on a lot of, you know, archways at colleges, and it is, knowledge plus character, that is the goal of true education. Knowledge plus character. And why am I saying this? Well, I really believe that something is lost when we give the knowledge without the instruction. Because instruction, it takes time. It takes effort. You guys, those of you in college, you understand this. It takes really hard effort. It takes a lot of time. And quite frankly, there is something that happens in the instruction period, that hard work, that diligence, that molds your character as you gain the knowledge. And why I say this is because in our day and age, there are tons and tons and tons of people with lots of knowledge and no character. Absolutely no character. And if you don't believe knowledge is dangerous, let me put it in perspective. What happens when a country like Iran gets the atomic bomb? All it is knowledge. It's knowledge. What happens when a group of people, a person, gains a level of knowledge without the requisite character? It's a nightmare, actually. What happens with the availability of knowledge to children who have not developed the character through experience and time? What happens with social media and a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, and the not only the availability of knowledge, but the existence of people who would prey on somebody like that? It's pretty incredible, this idea of people being given knowledge without character. I've said before that there was a point when we were actually looking at safeguards for our devices for our children, and as we were kind of Googling it and researching it, I was really kind of bummed and caught off guard by how many remarks there were on a ton of different sites by people and parents who were like totally against any sort of safeguards on social media for children. They're like, why would you want to limit your children's ability to learn? You know, and you're just like, there are certain things that I think that they shouldn't be exposed to without the character and the age, or maybe never exposed to. But I was actually kind of flabbergasted by the number of comments like that. But this idea here that whoever loves instruction loves knowledge, and I guess what I'm saying about this is the people who say they love knowledge but they don't love instruction, what this would say is you don't actually love knowledge. There's something wrong there when someone loves the knowledge without the instruction, and there's a danger there. Knowledge and character, that is the goal of true education, and something happens in the way of instruction as you humble yourself under another human being, and you exert the effort and you take the time and you put in all of those hours to pursue that knowledge. I think it does you good. It builds the character as you pursue the knowledge. Verse 2, a good man obtains favor from the Lord, but a man of wicked devices he will condemn. A man is not established by wickedness, but the root of the righteous cannot be moved. Verse 4, an excellent wife, or literally in the Hebrew, a woman of valor, is the crown of her husband, but she who causes shame is like rottenness in his bones. I really like this verse, not the second half so much. I really like this verse because this is a truth that has become obvious to Alicia and I. Maybe it was during a certain, maybe a marriage DVD series we were watching or something like that. But one of the things that I appreciate about my wife, and I've appreciated about her for a long time, is that she's not... well, everybody's prone to anxiety. I think as human beings, we're all prone to anxiety. But she's not a woman who gives in to her anxiety. And where I'm going with this is that in marriage, a wife who is anxious actually becomes a great shame to her husband. Not in the sense where he's ashamed of her, but in the sense that it's like rottenness to his bones. And let me explain why I say that. And reiterate that it's one of the things I actually love about my wife, because I don't feel like she's anxious. I don't come home from work and feel like my wife is like, her hair's falling out, and she's on the verge of tears every day. Some days she is, but once in a great while she might be on the verge of tears. But most days, my wife almost never strikes me as anxious. Why am I camping on this? Why am I saying this? Well, oddly enough, I've found, and I've talked to people, enough men over the years who are married and been privy to marriages where the wife is anxious and she is given over to anxiety, and it is like rottenness to her husband's bones. She's not a woman of valor. She's not a strong woman who takes her fears to the Lord and gains his strength. Why is it like rottenness to his bones? Well, from my perspective, the reason that it would become like rottenness to me if my wife was always anxious is because essentially as a husband, we have this need to provide and to do a good job at it. And it undermines that. If my wife is unnecessarily anxious, it undermines that feeling in me that I'm doing a good job as a husband. Essentially, like, man, if I was providing more, she wouldn't be anxious, or maybe if it was more this, or I did this better, or whatever. And quite frankly, and I'm not saying this is a sense that like that I'm not trying to put the onus on the woman, the onus for the husband's mental state on the woman, because each of us has to carry our own load. Each of us stands before the Lord on our own. That being said, though, in a healthy relationship, ladies, this is more aimed at you. I tell you the truth, as you move on to marriage and you get married, I hope that the Holy Spirit drives this home into your heart, that it is important that you take your anxieties to the Lord. It's important to share with your husband your anxieties if and when you have them, when they're serious or whatever. But I would encourage you and challenge you to primarily take your anxieties to the Lord and leave them there. And we're going to talk more about what that looks like later on in a different context. But I just say that because I personally believe that this is a cancer in a lot of marriages. And I'm not harping on you ladies. Husbands make all kinds of mistakes. Wives make a lot of mistakes too. This is a mistake, though, that many people are completely unaware of. When a wife is anxious, when she is not a woman of valor, when she she is constantly concerned about this and freaked out about that, it undermines one of the most essential needs that her husband has, and that is to feel like he's doing a good job. Now, if he's doing a terrible job, absolutely all the time, then he should probably be told about it, and there's a period for confrontation. But take that with a grain of salt. I think there's an important truth in there that I have seen how it works in our marriage in a really good way, and I've seen how it can be a very negative thing if not done correctly in other marriages. Verse 5, the thoughts of the righteous are right, but the counsels of the wicked are deceitful. The words of the wicked lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright will deliver them. The wicked are overthrown and are no more, but the house of the righteous will stand. A man will be commended according to his wisdom, but he who is of a perverse heart will be despised. Interesting, this last comment here, he who is of a perverse heart will be despised. This is really true. A lot of joking in the office place and in schools really revolves around perversity, you know, like who can tell the dirtiest joke to get a rise. But the interesting thing is when that's done in that environment, oddly enough, everybody may laugh to your face when you tell that perverse joke or when you join in, but actually they will grow to despise you for it, because a classy person doesn't even, and I'm talking from a worldly perspective, a classy person doesn't do that. A classy person doesn't need to resort to that. And from a godly perspective, it will undermine your witness, and people will despise you. And so it's kind of the problem with compromising and joining in, is that even though everybody laughs at those jokes around the water cooler, in their heart they tend to grow to despise that person. Verse 9, better is the one who is slighted but has a servant than he who honors himself but lacks bread. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this verse, and we're going to go to 1 Corinthians in a minute. But I want to kind of camp on this verse for a minute. Better is the one who is slighted but has a servant than he who honors himself but lacks bread. Better is he who is slighted but has a servant. Better is he who is successful but has a servant. Slighted but is successful than he who honors himself but lacks bread. The idea here is that I believe is being conveyed is an important one. This idea, when you care too much about what people think, you will be a slave and you will be poor. When you care too much about what other people think, you will be a slave. I'm paraphrasing, but there is a famous quote that goes something along the lines of, he is not free who cares what any other person thinks of him. As long as you are concerned with and preoccupied with what people think of you, you are a slave to them. You are a slave to whatever person that their opinion of you matters to you. You are a slave to them in one way or another. And I believe the idea being conveyed here is that better is the person who has no recognition, the person who nobody likes you and nobody esteems you. The idea there of being slighted is this idea of being lightly esteemed. Better is the person who is lightly esteemed and has a servant than the person who cares what everybody thinks about him but is a servant, is the idea here. And I believe it's carrying an idea that if you turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we'll look at. And it's this idea of being free. It's better to be free and have nobody like you or and to be lightly esteemed than to have a servant. And I think I said that wrong. But let's go to 1 Corinthians 7. And maybe this will shed more light. 1 Corinthians 7:25. This is an interesting passage. I really like this passage. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord. Hang with me, please. It's not really what we're talking about. I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. Now, and this is where we're going to with this, but this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on even those who have wives should be as though they had none, those who weep as though they did not weep, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing it, for the form of this world is passing away. But I want you to be without care. And that phrase right there is the key. I want you to be without care. I want you to be free. I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. I want you to be without care. Before it says that, it gives 4 different scenarios, 4 different startling scenarios. It says, those who are married should live as though they're not married, and those who weep as though they don't weep, and those who rejoice as though they don't rejoice. What's he saying? Well, he's giving 4 different scenarios about freedom. He's talking about a person who is free relationally, who is free emotionally, free financially, and free societally. And we're just going to look at these kind of briefly. But again, this idea of being free. And in particular, the last one where it says those who use this world as not misusing it, that putting the world in its proper place, as we'll look at. So free relationally, those who have wives should be as though they had none. This is an incredible phrase, and I dare say to you that it is actually the key to a happy Christian marriage. I'm not necessarily sure it's the key to a happy non-Christian marriage, though it probably would help. But to a happy Christian marriage, almost more than anything else except keeping Jesus at the center, this, in my opinion, is the key to a happy Christian marriage. Not only to a happy Christian marriage, but to being free spiritually to serve the Lord when you are married. So let me deal with those 2 issues and why it actually causes a happy Christian marriage. The reason it does that is it's best if I use an example from when I was 19, I don't remember, 18 or 19. My car was getting older, and so my mom was like, why don't you get rid of your old car? We need to get you a newer, reliable car. And so I was probably like 1999 or 2000, and she took me to the Honda dealership, and I'll never forget walking on the Honda dealership parking lot and seeing these cars. It was like a dream. It was 1999, and we were walking up and looking at not brand new, but almost brand new Honda Civics. And I'll never forget when I saw the car that we would later buy, and I was just walking around it, and I was like, this is the coolest car I've ever seen in my life. I'm like, this car is amazing. I thought it was and I'll never forget, and this is important because I'll never forget the way I felt about the car when I first looked at it. And I'm like, this car is perfect. It's beautiful. It's a manual. It's sleek looking. I loved everything about it, and we ended up buying this car. It was only 3 years old, only had like 20 or 30,000 miles on it. It wasn't 9 months later that I was almost completely unsatisfied with the car. You know why? Because I focused too much on the car. You see, the more I looked at the car, the more I sat at like the restaurant table and stared at my car out the window, the more I started to notice that the wheel well gaps, the distance between the top of my wheel and the fender, were a little too big. And if I really stared at it, I had to admit that it kind of looked like my car was always in mid-bounce. And I was like in the middle of a bounce. And I was like, which it wasn't, but the more I looked at it, the more I focused on it, the perceived flaws grew bigger and bigger, and the things I appreciated about the car grew smaller and smaller, and I became swiftly convinced, I'm like, I really need to lower it. We didn't call it slamming it back then, but, I'm like, I really need to lower it like 2.5 inches in the front, 2 inches in the back, and it's got hubcaps. The more I looked at it, the more I'm just like, dude, those hubcaps, it needs wheels, My wife still, I'm not going to re-explain it, but some of you probably would need me to explain the difference between hubcaps and wheels and rims. I'm not going to. I've learned the hard way that some people just will never understand that difference. Regardless, but the more I looked at it, the more I was like, and these were real thoughts. I'm dead serious about this. And the more I looked at it, I'm like, the headlights are too big. I need some of those like eyelid covers on the front of it, and it could really use a spoiler. And it's not quite loud enough, and so it really needs an exhaust and an intake, and it's really not quite fast enough. And my point is this, is interestingly enough, the more I focused on and stared at my at this thing that I'll never forget the way I felt when I first saw it. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I couldn't imagine ever needing to change anything about it. And it wasn't a year later I was looking at it, I'm like, I want to change everything about it. I want to change everything. The color's okay, the interior's okay, but pretty much everything else I want to change about it. And I tell you the truth, this is the way life is. For the person, and Christians are particularly guilty of this, the Christian who gets married and they're like, I'm going to have the best marriage ever. And they're like, and so they focus on the marriage and they turn inward. The more they stare at the marriage, the more marriage conferences, a lot of times, that they go to, they actually end up looking at the marriage in the perceived faults, which are actually relatively minor and may not even be faults at all, grow larger and larger and larger. And in short order, oftentimes, I have seen Christians within a year of getting married being like, dude, I want to call it quits. And you talk to them and you're like, I think you're kind of blowing that out of proportion, or you started blowing that out of proportion a while ago. Alicia and I actually got to a point, we actually got to a point where we stopped going to marriage conferences because we'd go to a marriage conference, and I'll never forget the one, I remember exactly where we were in the car when we're like, we're not going back to that marriage seminar. The next day, we were in front of the Cape Canaveral Hospital, it was night, we were driving home from it, and we were fighting. And we hadn't fought in years. I don't know if we'd ever fought, actually, in our marriage. And we were fighting, driving home from a marriage conference. Well, you know what happened? I learned an important lesson. Some marriage conferences, there's a distinction. Some marriage conferences tend to make you want more out of your spouse. And some marriage conferences challenge you to be more in a way that doesn't inform the spouse. But this particular marriage conference, we left, and you know what? The more they talked about what an ideal marriage should be and looked like, the more I looked at our marriage sitting there in the church listening to this marriage conference going, yeah, Alicia really could do that. Alicia, and she probably was sitting there going, yeah, Chris really should do the dishes 4 times a day. That's an ideal husband. That's what he does, And I'm like, she had 4 hairs out of place. And I tell you guys the truth, though, honestly, there's a real key here to having a happy married life. Now, it's not the reason Paul says it. He's not saying it so that you'll have a happy marriage. He's saying it so that you would be free to serve the Lord, which is the second point. But I'll tell you, as is true of all spiritual truths, they actually are their benefits are manifold. They have multifaceted benefits to them, and this one is like that too. This idea of the married living as though they're not married actually is healthy for a marriage. And Alicia and I, you can ask her, we would tell you that over the years, as we have sacrificed quite a bit of time, and I'm hesitant to even call it a sacrifice, there were small seasons and days where it was a sacrifice, but as we have devoted a lot of time on top of our jobs to doing the youth group and all those years, I don't regret it, not only for the heavenly value of it, but for the value, the pragmatic value that it's been to our marriage, because it makes us appreciate each other. I'll tell you the truth. Some people, they fight because they spend too much time together. They are in each other's face, focusing on their marriage, focusing on each other, and it would do them some good to get their eyes outside of their marriage and out to the world or into the church, looking for areas where they can live as though they're not married for a period. And this doesn't mean anything weird like you shouldn't live together or shouldn't sleep together or something. It doesn't mean anything like that. It means that in your life, living in such a way that the married live as though they're not married. And I'll tell you the truth, it is an absolute, one of the 3 fundamental keys. You guys were giving me a hard time about the movies. This is one of the 3, I would say, fundamental keys to marriage. If not right below keeping Jesus in the center, is living as though you're not married. You want a happy marriage? Don't focus on your marriage. Don't stare at your marriage. Don't spend too much time trying to go to marriage ceremonies, seminars that are going to make you look at your spouse and go, he could be doing this better, or she could be doing that better. It's very unhealthy, honestly, actually, to marriages. But the other part is, in tying into what we were saying before, this idea of being free. The reason Paul is saying this, he's not saying this to put a yoke of bondage on anybody, and he makes that very clear in the passage. He's like, I'm not trying to put a yoke of bondage on you. I'm not trying to bind you up. He's like, the purpose is actually to free you. If you live this way, it will free you to be useful to the Lord. Secondly, this is 2-part. Those who weep It appears two part, but it's one part. Those who weep as though they did not weep, verse 30, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Free emotionally. This one, if you're tracking with everything I've already said about marriage, you probably are aware of where I'm going to go with this point and what I believe this point is saying. This is along the same lines. There are some Christians that are too caught up in how they feel, whether it be good or bad. It could be good or it could be bad. Some Christians are overly focused on the good side, and I think there are probably even whole movements that are overly focused on the good side and being happy all the time and everything being good, and they're too focused on their emotions. And it's, he would say here, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Don't try and hold it to yourself and be in a place where you're always rejoicing. If you rejoice, rejoice and let it come and go. Be content with the Lord. Be free to serve the Lord. Those who weep as though they did not weep. There's like, I love that Jars of Clay lyric, and I believe it's from Worlds Apart, where in the line, he says the one line that says, from a world embracing every heartache. And I've known non-believers and I've known believers that they, like, every single time there's a heartbreak, they like embrace it and they grab it and they just focus on it, and they're almost like the Eeyore type of person who's like, I just weeping and weeping and weeping and weeping. Well, there's a time to stop weeping. There's a time to stop weeping. There is a truth in the Old Testament. It's incredible. When God took the prophet Ezekiel's wife, do you remember what God said to him the night before he took her? He said, tomorrow I'm going to take your wife. She's going to die. And he said something to him. He said, don't do one thing. What did he say? Don't mourn. Don't mourn for her. That's a crazy thing. That's a crazy truth. And I tell you guys the truth. There's something embedded in that we should have even our mourning, our weeping and our rejoicing should both be brought into submission to God's lordship. And there are some people that I think they can almost tend to rejoice too much, or they're too focused on wanting to rejoice in their life, always being overly happy. But then there are people who their life becomes marked by a tragedy, and they never seem to get out of the weeping. And I think that it dishonors God. And I'm not just saying that from my point of view. I'm actually sharing from an excerpt from one of John Corson's teachings after his wife and his daughter died. He said there's a time essentially to stop weeping. There's a time where it dishonors God when we carry on too long and we're too focused on this life and not on eternity. Those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Notice in these verses, it doesn't say don't weep. That's not what I'm saying. It says when you weep, it says as though you don't weep. It's not saying as an absolute negative, don't weep, you shouldn't weep, or you shouldn't rejoice. We do those things, but we let them come and go, and they have their place. We as spiritual beings are to be free in Christ in this world, and to the degree that your emotions are submitted to the lordship of Christ will affect your freedom and your usability to the Lord. The third one, those who buy as though they did not possess. And I think you guys are probably tracking with me, and if I'm making sense, and this is true, you probably already know where I would go with this one. Those who buy as though they did not possess. It's not so much talking about the truth, the Dave Ramsey, Larry Burkett truth, like only pay cash for everything. That's kind of, I see how you could kind of contort that into this truth here and be like, owe no man anything except, to love the Lord or whatever. I see how you could maybe contort that truth into this, but I don't actually think it's the truth that's fundamentally here, though that's wise, to owe no man everything. It's really the other truth that's like, when you begin to think of something as your possession, like I possess this thing, it's kind of a sign that it might possess you. When you are unwilling, like Jesus said, to when someone asks for your cloak, your coat, give him your cloak also, like that verse. This idea that we possess things, and we as Americans are really, I think, really bad about this. That we tend to possess the things that we own, and that's mine. Don't touch that, or all these different things are ours. And that when you look at it as though you possess it, it probably possesses you, and it probably is limiting your freedom and your usability. Fourthly, for the form of this world is passing away. I'm sorry. Those who use this world, verse 31, and those who use this world as not misusing it, for the form of this world is passing away. Those who use this world as not misusing it. What is it talking about there? Well, it gives us a hint in the phrase after. It says, the form of this world is passing away. Those who use this world as not misusing it, for the form of it's passing away. Well, this is one of those $100 Greek words that you're like so glad the New Testament is in the Greek. This is the Greek word schema. It's from a Greek word that we get our word like scheme or scene and schematic from. This idea of the form of the world. And there actually is debate as to the original origin of the word, but a lot of people think the original origin of the word is actually a scene in a play, that it was like a scene in a play. And all of those kind of fit this idea here that the form of the world, the scheme of the world, the schematic of the world, or this scene that is playing out on the world's stage, all the world is a stage, it's passing away. And those who use this world as not misusing it. Well, what is it saying there? I believe, personally, and this is where it ties back in, this is the truth that ties in with what we're considering in Proverbs chapter 12, that the way that you misuse the world is when you try to use the world for your own glory. When you try to use the world for your own glory. Because it does say we are to use the world, and we do use the world as people. We use the world's resources, and we use things in the world, but we are to use them for His glory. And we begin to abuse the things in the world when we use them for our glory. And if you meditate on this truth, I really believe it will expand, and it actually, you will find that it is correct. So tying that back in to Proverbs chapter 12 there, better is one who is slighted but has a servant than he who honors himself but lacks bread. Now keep in mind here, this idea of honoring yourself is seeking glory, wanting glory, seeking to use this world for your own glory. Better is one who is slighted, who nobody gives any glory to, but has a servant. And I would say that the idea here is that you make this idea that the world is either your servant or you are the world's servant, in this sense that you either use the world, you make the world a servant, you use the world, and you become successful at using the world for God's glory, or you try to live for your own glory so that people will esteem you, and you abuse it. I challenge you to consider that truth. So verse 10, a righteous man regards the life of his animal, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. Interesting verse. I don't necessarily believe that this verse is intended to be taken to say that all Christians should be vegan. That being said, though, it is an interesting verse. The righteous man regards the life of his animal. I have kids, and wanting them to grow up healthy, I am teaching them constantly at this stage in their life to be kind to animals. It's partially because I am an animal lover and I don't like seeing animals suffer. That being said, though, it's also because there's something godly about it. God is kind to things that are weaker than him. He's kind to things that are smaller than him. He's kind to things that are less substantial than him. That's part of what godliness is. And quite frankly, I actually go through this train of thought with my children. I'm like, Lexi, Josh, we are kind to animals. Alicia thinks we're too kind. I do kill mosquitoes, but I have been known to catch a lot of bugs and small reptiles and put them out of the house, which my wife doesn't like. She wants me to obliterate them. And I don't. Throwing you under the bus, honey. The one that we really argue on is the mosquito hawks. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? The big ones? Like, I like those. They don't bite. And Alicia's like, kill it. And I'm like trying to catch it and chasing it around the house. And that's when I start getting spiritual with the children. And I'm like, Lexi, it's godly to be kind to things that are small. No, I haven't said it about the mosquito hawks. It's mostly when one of the children is going to do something they haven't thought through with one of the. We have a box turtle that I caught a week ago that's been in the backyard for a while. And Josh, he picks him up too much, and yeah, it's just Bear licks him a lot, the box turtle. Anyways, a righteous man regards the life of his animal. It's not, I think a lot of Christians are a little too cavalier, when it comes to dealing with vegans in particular. I would say that about this verse. I've probably been guilty of that, but I know that a lot of Christians, you can go on YouTube and there are tons of Christians and people from our point of view that kind of trash vegans and people who care about animals. Oh no, I love steak and I love manatees. They're great with mashed potatoes and gravy, and all that stuff. And I mean, I get the joke, but that being said, though, I don't think it's godly to take this attitude of just like abusing the world, abusing all of the things in the world and destroying them just for the sake of the fact that we can. A righteous man does regard the life of his animal, and I guess the reason I share that, the reason it matters is because it's godly to be kind to things that are smaller, weaker, or less substantial than you are. He who tills his land will be satisfied with bread, but he who follows frivolity is devoid of understanding. The wicked covet the catch of evil men, but the root of the righteous yields fruit. The wicked is ensnared by the transgression of his lips, but the righteous will come through trouble. A man will be satisfied with good by the fruit of his mouth, and the recompense of a man's hands will be rendered to him. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes. This kind of ties in just with that. What you guys, most of you who've listened to me teach for any length of time know that what I think is probably the scariest concept in all of Scripture is in James 1, where it says, "But be ye doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves." This idea that you can, as a believer, as a human being, deceive yourself. And it says that here, interestingly enough, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, that he is deceiving himself and he thinks he's fine when he's not. That's a pretty scary thought. How do you deal with self-deception? Because we all have it. Every single one of us in this room has self-deception one way or another. I've shared before, just share it quickly again. You can make a mathematical formula out of that verse in James 1 where it says, "But be ye doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves." Any part of the word that you have more knowledge than action, the difference is deception. So if you have this amount of knowledge of the word and you have this amount of action, the difference is deception. And that's not my mathematical equation there, but I will tell you guys that there's a truth there, and I think every single one of us in this room, particularly probably because we're all from Calvary Chapel, or we admire Calvary Chapel and how much Calvary Chapel focuses on the Word, and we all probably know a lot of the Word. Every single one of us, and myself included, guilty maybe even more than anyone else, we have more knowledge than we have action, and so there is self-deception there. There's a level of self-deception where maybe we've become okay. We've been foolish with the amount that we know and the amount that we've been inactive on what we know. Well, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with self-deception? Because you're the one that deceived yourself. So it's not as easy as just kind of becoming aware of it. Well, one of the ways out of it is given here. It says there in the next part of verse 15, "But he who heeds counsel is wise." So one of the first ways to deal with self-deception is to get counsel. This is a really challenging thing because it's really uncomfortable, and I don't even want to say it because I don't want to do it myself. But let me challenge you on something. Why don't you go to somebody who would be really honest with you, like Mark, and and say, "Dude, is there something in my life that maybe I don't see that everybody else sees?" It's kind of like that saying about pride. Pride is the one disease that everybody else except the bearer knows about. Is there something, and I don't think we should all go to Mark, but Mark's been pretty faithful to tell me when I'm really off, and to what if we did that? What if every single one of us in this room went to, not necessarily your best friend or your someone, especially not to somebody who always just tells you nice things about yourself, but someone that'll tell you the truth. Why don't you go to that person and say, is there is there anything in my life that's really obviously where I might be deceiving myself, where I think, I'm doing pretty well and maybe I'm not? That's a pretty challenging thing, actually, to consider. So, but he who heeds counsel is wise. But the other way out of it is to ask the Lord. And I'm sure you guys are thinking of Psalm 139, where David says, try my heart and know it, essentially. Search me and know me, Lord. See if there's any wicked way in me. And so I would encourage those two propositions to you, to maybe ask for counsel if there's self-deception, and to ask the Lord to search you and know you. Verse 16, a fool's wrath is known at once. Oh, I'm so guilty of that. A fool's wrath is known at once. We should be far more patient. It's so foolish to make your wrath known at once. How many times I've opened my mouth in wrath over something I thought was an injustice or something, and I only had half the story. Don't smile too much, honey. Oh my gosh, this is such a hard one for me. I can be that way. But a prudent man covers shame. He who speaks truth declares righteousness, but a false witness deceit. There's one who speaks like the piercing of a sword, but the tongue of the wise promotes health. The truthful lip shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. Deceit is in the heart of those who devise evil, but counselors have peace. Counselors of peace have joy. Counselors of peace have joy. If you have a serious deficit of joy in your life, it might be, there are two elements to this: counselors and counselors of peace. One reason that we can find ourselves very miserable is that we stop giving out. We stop helping other people. And if you saw God's Not Dead too, they made a really good point of this verse. Actually, they didn't actually point this verse out. But how many of you guys saw it? Wow, you guys really need to see it. It's really good. There's a scene where the Chinese guy, he's kind of struggling, the one who got saved in the first movie, and he's got all these questions for the pastor, and he's coming and talking to him, and he's going through a really hard time. His dad has come and disowned him and kind of smacked him around, and he's at the church, and he's singing a hymn at the piano, and this other girl who is struggling more than he is and is even younger than him in the faith comes in, and she doesn't know he's not the pastor, and after he's done, he's like crying and pouring his heart out to the Lord, and she starts talking to him, and then she starts asking him questions, and then he starts giving her answers, and it's after he starts counseling this young lady, and he's a relatively new convert himself, that there's this transformation, and he decides that he actually wants to be in the ministry and wants to be used by the Lord. And I thought they made a really good point of it in the movie, actually, that this is a truth that you find throughout the scriptures, that when you give out, you will find more being poured into you. And when we get stingy and focused on ourselves and focused on all the things we want, that's when our joy just leaves. But in particular, this idea here that counselors of peace have joy, this idea of counseling people, I believe this peace, the Bible speaks of several different types of peace: peace with God, spiritual peace, and this idea here of making peace. And I love that beatitude where it says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." But counselors of peace have joy. No grave trouble will overtake the righteous, but the wicked shall be filled with evil. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who deal truthfully are his delight. A prudent man conceals knowledge, but the heart of fools proclaims foolishness. The hand of the diligent will rule, but the slothful will be put to forced labor. Interesting. The slothful will be put to forced labor. There's more going on there than it first seems. The slothful will be put to forced labor. Essentially, the idea here is the slothful doesn't want to work, but by pursuing this carnal desire, they end up doing the one thing they don't want to do. And there's a truth here for you guys at your age, though I'm not really sure it necessarily applies to any of you. But this idea that if now is the period in your life where you can be diligent. You can be diligent about college. You can be diligent about pursuing a career or a field or some sort of trade or something. You can be diligent about it. But I tell you the truth, if you're this is particularly true about you guys. If you're slothful at this age, you will one day find yourself in forced labor. You will find yourself one day, and this is a truth that I've seen at work so many times in people's lives who, when they were you guys' age, didn't really think much about going to college. And you guys know me. I'm the first to tell you, hey, if God's calling you, don't go to college. I dropped out of my college program because God called me to go to Bible college. So I'm the first. You guys understand that. I'm not this person that's always pumping, be a professional, go to college no matter what. But I will tell you guys the truth. At this stage in your life, if you're slothful, you one day will be put to forced labor. And I was talking, I think it was with Mark actually, because we've been training a lot lately. We were talking about this. I have found that having a good job, if the Lord provides in the way that which He has for me, a good job can free you up to minister. A good job really, truly can free you up to minister. And I have found that to be true over the years, that the job that God provided for me was perfect in that it provided a living for my family, but also provided a lot of freedom for ministry. Because the truth about this here is the slothful person will be put to forced labor. Like, if I didn't have a decent job, I would be working 4 jobs to make the same amount of money. And I'm just being really honest with you guys. I'm actually not even talking about the job I now have. I'm talking about the job I had for the last 9 years as an inspector. And that job, because it not only the time frame of that job, but also because it helped provide for my family, that it freed me to actually do ministry. And this is something I feel needs to be said to your generation, because there are a lot of kids in your generation, in particular the guys who just sit at home and play video games all day, and they fail to launch, and they're slothful. But what they don't understand is sooner or later their parents are either going to get fed up with them, or their parents are going to die, and one day they're going to be put to forced labor. And when they could have been diligent at a point in their life at your age, and it would lead to actually, honestly, freedom. And I want to encourage you guys, because I know a lot of you are really working hard at school. You guys are not only doing your classes, you also have jobs. I know a lot of you are working your rear ends off. You're in the study labs, you're doing those things. And I want to encourage you, and I want to say you're doing a good thing. This is a really good thing, because I wish more Christians worked as hard as they possibly could in this life to be free, to be useful to the Lord, not to get as much money for yourself as possible. But it would be awesome if we had more really wealthy Christians that could support other Christians in ministries and actually weren't forced into forced labor where they could never seem to find the time to be useful to the Lord. Now, all of that is kind of like the rest of Proverbs. It's not an absolute truth. What I'm sharing with you is sort of a paradigm that seems to really work, and it seems to be how life works, that the slothful will be put to forced labor. A lot of you guys are doing really good, and I think you can get too focused on college and the season that you're in, and you feel like it's always going to be like it is now, because I have a feeling that some of you are really discouraged, and I want to encourage you that, in the blink of an eye, you're going to be 2, 5, 7, 8 years out of college, and you're going to be like, where did it go? And life is going to be upon you, and you are not, I promise you, or a trade or whatever it is, like with Joel. Joel's working hard to build a business. I'm not saying college is the only way, but this idea of working hard, you won't regret it 8, 10, 12, 15 years from now. I promise you won't regret it. Verse 25, anxiety in the heart of man causes depression. Anxiety in the heart of man causes depression, but a good word makes it glad. I was going to make some comments about this verse, but I think we need to get to verse 28, because I just had some comments about that. We're running out of time. Verse 26, the righteous should choose his friends carefully, for the way of the wicked leads them astray. That one's pretty obvious. I will say this, those of you who go away to college, be careful about who you make friends with. Verse 27, the slothful man, The slothful man does not roast what he took in hunting. I love this. This is one of those obvious-isms. But diligence is a man's precious possession. I already kind of bled into this point. But the slothful man does not roast what he took in hunting. That's one to memorize right there. Think about it. It's brilliant, actually. The slothful man does not roast what he took in hunting because he didn't go hunting. And he has nothing to eat because he's lazy. Why don't I have any game? I actually mean like animals, not like, like game. Why don't I have any game? Well, it could be that too, actually. Because you are not hunting. And I've noticed. Take that or leave it. I'm not saying that's a word from the Lord. But the truth is, though, why don't I have any game? Why don't I have anything to eat? Because you're not out hunting. You're not out working hard. It's not God's fault. I have known people, you guys' age and in the 20 age bracket, who they're kind of mad at God for the way their life turned out. Because they don't have anything to eat, because they don't have any game. And the truth is very honestly that there's probably slothfulness has taken its part there. I think there are some other truths in this one, like, why has happiness eluded me? Well, it might be because you're not trying at life. You've checked out. And I think to the person that checks out, and because there are different reasons for being lazy. Some people, they appear lazy because they're depressed, and they're just kind of checked out of life. Other people, they're just kind of lazy because they've given into pleasure. And so there's usually kind of a reason for laziness. But typically speaking, lazy people are not happy. And that's kind of the sad thing. Why am I still single? Could it be because of laziness? I have to admit, I have to be really honest with you guys. I have had a number of people in the last 12 or 15 years come to me complaining or just really sad about being single. Really sad, whether they be girls or whether they be guys. But I'm going to really deal with the guys because laziness tends to be more of a guy's thing, at least as far as is obvious to me. And I have known guys who have come to me over the years and they're like, why am I single? Why has God not brought me a wife? And if I was completely honest, which to be honest, I've never been completely honest, when that question's asked, I would say, well, it's kind of obvious to me because you're not currently marriage material. You are not currently working really hard to catch the game. And so why are you surprised that you don't have any game to roast? Why are you surprised that you don't have any food to roast? And I don't mean this. You guys also know, part of my testimony, Alicia and I got married while I had a $10 an hour labor job, okay? And so I'm not this person that's like, you have to have a job to get married and you have to be making a living. It was actually, you guys know, it was an argument that Alicia's dad and I actually had when Alicia and I were engaged because I was a laborer in a low-paying job. So take this all under that advisement from my heart when I share this, though, that I have known a lot of kids that maybe they heard my testimony and they're like, oh, well, Chris got married while he had a laboring job, and so that's kind of the way it works. Well, yeah, it is. Sometimes it is the way it works, but maybe maybe that person shouldn't be surprised when there's no duck on the stove, when there's no no rabbit on the stove to roast that night when you haven't pursued it, when you haven't worked hard. And I'm not even talking about pursuing a person for a relationship. I'm talking about working hard at life. There is really a truth here. There's a spiritual paradigm here that is important. Why hasn't this ministry opened up? I've known people that wanted to be in ministry, you guys' age, younger, older, whatever. People who've wanted to be in ministry, and they're lazy, and they're questioning God about it. And they're like, why hasn't a ministry opened up to me yet? And if I'm completely honest, either I already knew this or I got to know them better, and I go, well, you're lazy. You practically never study your Bible. You don't buy spiritual books. You don't put the money and effort into growing spiritually and growing in wisdom. And in that person, I look and I go, maybe that person shouldn't be surprised that ministry's not. You shouldn't be surprised that there's no game in the pot on the stove because you haven't been out hunting. You haven't put in the effort. I hope I'm not doing any injustice to this verse. I really believe he's not just talking about food. At least God's not. The slothful man does not roast what he took in hunting. We're talking a lot about laziness tonight. I pray that the Lord would remove any root of laziness that any of us has. I know it can spring up in any of us, but diligence is a man's precious possession. Verse 28, in the way of righteousness is life. I got 4 minutes for this verse. In the way of righteousness is life, and in its pathway there is no death. In the way of righteousness is life. So 2 things here. The way. Firstly, the way. In the way of righteousness is life. There's a verse in Hebrews where it says that God anointed Jesus. It says, therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness. The Father speaking to the Son. Because you hated lawlessness and loved righteousness. And there's a truth that happiness is not something that you gain by pursuing it. There's a scene in the movie A Walk to Remember where the daughter and the father are arguing about whether the daughter should be dating the bad boy in school. And the father's like, God, he's a minister, is like, God wouldn't want you to date him. And she essentially, her response and her whole thing is, I think God wants me to be happy. And so what she was saying was, because God wants me to be happy, my decision-making process is dependent upon what makes me happy. So I'm just going to look at life like Joel Osteen's wife, and I'm going to choose whichever path makes me happiest. Well, it's not the complete truth, and I'm not here to say that God wants you miserable either. He doesn't. He loves you. He loves you. He likes you. He does want you happy because he loves you. The problem is when you make happiness the determining factor in your decisions, you will miss it. It's exactly like when you are trying to fly from one place to another and you're looking at a flat map. If you don't take into account the curvature of the earth, you will end up somewhere else. So if you're hopping an airplane and you take a flat map with you and you go, oh, okay, I need to go at 090. I'm gonna go in this direction, and you start heading in that direction based on the flat map because that's due east, if I'm not mistaken. That will take me to this place. The problem is that if you head for Jacksonville based on a flat map, you're going to end up in misery. And so the point is that aiming for happiness is like taking a flat map, because what happens is when you aim for happiness, you end up in misery. But if, like Jesus, you aim for righteousness and you aim for pleasing God, you will end up in happiness. And it takes into account the curvature or the difference in the spiritual realm. And the reason I say that, he says here, the way of righteousness leads, in the way of righteousness is life. Now, let me make a distinction here. This is talking about quality of life, not quantity of life. In the way of righteousness is life, not the way of righteousness leads to life or creates a long life. This is the way of in the way of righteousness is life. And this is a very important distinction in Scripture. And if you're tracking with me, it's definitely dealing with quality of life, not quantity of life. And how I know that is because this point is borne out in the New Testament. In John 10:10, that's the verse where Jesus said, I have come that you might have life, and that more abundantly. Does anybody know what the Greek word for life is there? Zoe, correct. What's the other Greek word that's commonly translated life? Bios, right, bios. Those are the two Greek words in the New Testament. Interestingly enough, if you were to pull out a Greek interlinear, you will see that bios is only used in the New Testament about 10 times, but Zoe is used a number of times, probably around 30 or 40 times Zoe is used. It's usually the Greek word that is translated life, and in particular, whenever Jesus is talking about life in a good way, like that, I have come that you might have life, he used the word Zoe. Very important, because you guys understand bios, so it's where we get biology. It's that word talks about biological life, the biological aspect of you. Zoe, it had various meanings, but primarily, Christianly speaking, it was talking about spiritual life. That's what we understand it to mean. Now, I'm just going to turn. You can write these down. I don't recommend you turn here because I'm just going to read a couple verses from 1 Timothy on, and I just want you to pick up on this idea here. So 1 Timothy says this. I'm in 1 Timothy 1:16 says, "However, for this reason I obtained mercy, that in me first Jesus Christ might show all longsuffering as a pattern to those who are going to believe in him for everlasting life." Zoe. Chapter 2, verse 2, still 1 Timothy, "Therefore I exhort," starting in verse 1, "Therefore I exhort first of all, that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence." Which one do you think it is there? It's bias. Yep. That we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in godliness and reverence. I've always wondered about that verse. I don't know if you have, but there's a very important distinction there. He's not talking about living a quiet and peaceable spiritual life. He's talking about living a quiet and peaceable biological life, as we as believers should aim for that. 1 Timothy 4:8 says this, "For bodily exercise profits a little, but godliness is profitable for all things, having promise of the life that now is and of that which is to come." Zoe. Being contrasted very interestingly, without using the word bios, with being contrasted very interestingly there with biological life, bodily exercise. 2 Timothy, I'm just picking up there in 2 Timothy 1:1, it says, "Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the will of God, according to the promise of life which is in Christ Jesus." Zoe. 2 Timothy 2:4, "No one engaged in warfare entangles himself in the affairs of this life," bios, "that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier." 2 Timothy 1, verse 10, "But has now been revealed by the appearing of our Savior Jesus Christ, who has abolished death and brought life," Zoe, "and immortality to light through the gospel." And if you guys are catching the distinctions there, let me ask you a question at this point as we're almost done. Lately, in your spiritual life, lately in your life, have you been focusing on your biological life or on your spiritual life? Because there is a night and day contrast in the New Testament that the original readers of the New Testament would have picked up on, because it wasn't one word in the Greek, it's two words in the Greek. And they wouldn't even necessarily have linked the two words in the way that we do, because they're both, and it's like that in the Greek. There are four words for love, and whatnot. And this is also true. Are you focusing? Are you completely preoccupied with the biological aspects of your life? Now, by necessity, we have to be, whether we like it or not, we have to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We have to sleep. We have to, as I've been talking about, do jobs, go to school, and do things like that. And those things are all biological. And so, by default, our biological life can tend to rule us just by the imminence of it and the dailiness of it. And so it's a very real choice that we have to make to constantly reset our focus on Zoe, on the spiritual life. And as I tie this up, please notice the three contrasts in those verses I read with bios is that bios was bodily, it was interpersonal, and it was responsibilities, and it was focused bodily there with exercise, but it could be other things. And that's where bodily, whether it be pleasures, whether it be exercise, whether it be whatever, some Christians get, and I've known Christians who have become so preoccupied with, whether it be exercise or whether it be whatever, sports, or it could be a lot of things, they become too preoccupied with biological life through their bodily appetites. Quiet and peaceable looks at this interpersonal part of the biological life, and some Christians become sidetracked by their preoccupation with their interpersonal relationships with each other. They're constantly focused on who slighted who likes who, this, that, and the other. And they fail to understand that one interesting truth about biological life there in the Epistle to Timothy, and that was that we should aspire to lead a quiet and peaceable biological life. Responsibilities, that we should not become entangled. This is a hard one. I don't even know how it works itself out. I have a job. I have a family. We have soccer practices. We have bills to pay. We have to provide 3 healthy meals for our children every single day and make sure that they're eating, sleeping, happy, healthy, not killing each other and not spoiled and all. It's hard not to become entangled with the affairs of this life, because it's not necessarily a negative connotation. And this is the final idea here. This idea of life, and I don't have much to say about it except to say this. It's the idea in John 14:6 where Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Notice he didn't say, I give you the life, or I'm the one who gives life. He said, I am the life. And I'll tell you, because he used the word I am, that this is the clearest concept in the Old Testament of what God meant when he said his name was I am. And then it places like when he provided the ram for Abraham in the thicket on Mount Moriah to sacrifice instead of Isaac, he said his name, I am the provision. Now, it's poorly translated into God provides or God will provide. That is not what it says in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, it's literally I am provision. I am the provision. Jehovah Jireh, Yahweh Jireh. That's what it says in the Hebrew, I am, and it's clarified in the New Testament when Jesus came on the scene, and in certain places he took the Greek equivalent of the Tetragrammaton, and he was like, I am the life. I am the resurrection. Before Abraham was, I am. But he linked it in numerous places, and in the Greek it was much clearer. He said, I am the life. And all of that is to say this, believers, as you're here with me tonight, this concept that Jesus is the life, as I already asked you a question, if you've been focusing on the biological or the spiritual life, the very simple determinant factor is when you seek God, are you seeking his hand or his heart? Because he would say to you, I am the life. And some of us are seeking biological life. We're seeking more for our bodily appetites. We're seeking all these other things. And when we do seek God, we're only seeking his hand. We're seeking what he provides. We believe his name should mean I will provide. God will provide. And that's not what it means. It means I am the provision, and you will find it in him. Are you seeking his hand or his heart? Because the life that we all long for, the life that the founders of our country were talking about when they said for the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, that life there, it's the same thing we're talking about. It's not necessarily or primarily longevity of days. It's this idea of the life that all men want, an abundant life, a meaningful life, a satisfying life, a life full of joy. And all of that, it's found in Christ and only in him. And that's why we must seek his heart. That's why we cannot draw back from worship. Worship is a choice at times to give him the sacrifice of praise. It's a choice at times to do that. I am going to draw near. I am going to seek his heart. I'm going to seek him. I'm not going to seek life out there or any other place, because life is in him. He really genuinely meant that when he said, I am the life. In the way of righteousness is life. Interesting, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life.